I can't start so far down tonight, so what I'm going to start with is that last verse that we looked at last week, Romans 1, verse 17, where we are told that a righteousness from God is revealed. And the fact that God is righteous serves as both a challenge and a comfort to us as we enter into these verses 18 to 32. The challenge, the righteousness of human conduct and behavior must be determined not by us, but by the unchanging revelation of a holy God. The comfort, there is such a God, and he does reveal his standards for our lives. In other words, there is someone in whom truth can be found. There is someone in whom perfect righteousness exists. Having said that, tonight we come to this terrifying picture painted in the verses that we just read. And it really hits home that salvation, the kind of salvation that we celebrated in the songs we just sang, salvation is only relevant if there is something we need to be saved from. It's only a remedy if there's a problem. It's only a cure if there is a disease. And the reality in our world today and in Paul's way back when is that while many will acknowledge that there exists a huge problem of evil in the world, they simply will not acknowledge any responsibility for it. Before we can really dig in and appreciate the good news of the gospel, we must come to grips with the bad news. We have to face it head on, and that's what Paul begins to articulate in these verses beginning at 1:18, and actually it goes for a while. It goes all the way through chapter 3, verse 20. He lays out a case against us that demands a single and inescapable verdict. He demonstrates the universality of human sin, its scope and its depth, what we in our tradition call total depravity. In our verses this evening, Paul is talking specifically to the Gentiles, and he is condemning them. He goes on in chapter 2 to address and condemn the Jews as well, saying that both groups stand guilty, that all human beings, including you and I, stand guilty. And in addressing both groups, as we will see tonight and next week as we look further, that Paul uses the same formula in building his case against us. He reminds people of their knowledge of God. He confronts them with the fact that they haven't lived up to their knowledge of God, regardless of what measure they have it in. He accuses them of suppressing, even contradicting the knowledge of God, continuing in their unrighteousness, and thereby standing inexcusably guilty before God. No one can plead innocence because no one can plead ignorance. Heidelberg Catechism, question and answer 10 says this: does God permit such disobedience and rebellion to go unpunished? And the answer is certainly not. God is terribly angry with the sin that we are born with, as well as the sins that we personally commit. As just judge, God will punish them both now and in eternity, having declared, "Cursed is everyone who does not observe and obey all the things written in the book of the law." In our passage this evening, God's wrath, this wrath that Paul is talking about, God's wrath isn't revealed as we usually think about it, with fire and brimstone. We don't have people being struck down by lightning bolts. No, God's wrath is revealed in that he gave them over to their wickedness. It says it in verse 24, God gave them over to the sinful desires of their hearts. Verse 26, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Verse 28, Since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind. God's judgment at work today in the world is a giving us over to what it is we are pursuing. In these verses, we see the consequences of God's allowing free will to run its course. God giving human beings the right to choose their own course of action. So if we want to treat physical pleasure and physical experience as more important than spiritual reality, God lets us do so. If we want our fallen human desire to be the priority over God's will and God's purposes in our lives and in this world, God lets us do it. In other words, God gives us what we choose, nothing more, nothing less. That is the price of human freedom, and also, I believe, it is an accurate description of hell as well. C.S. Lewis, in The Problem of Pain, said, "The lost enjoy forever the horrible freedom they had demanded." And also in a different work of his, The Great Divorce, he says, "There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, 'Thy will be done,' and those to whom God says in the end, 'Thy will be done.' All that are in hell choose it." See, the righteousness of God as it comes to us in the gospel is so significant because the wrath of God is such an awesome reality. You can't really have one without the other. And we do a disservice to ourselves and to others to ignore or downplay the reality of God's wrath. It doesn't get near as much play as it probably should in churches today. J.I. Packer says, "Just as God is good to those who trust him, he is terrible to those who do not." And understand, God's wrath is perfectly logical, considering who he is, and it's perfectly justified considering who he is. John Murray said, "Wrath is the holy revulsion of God's being against that which is the contradiction to his holiness." And so what is it about the human situation that has moved God to such anger? Well, we get the short answer in the first verse that we read tonight, verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Spiritual ungodliness and moral wickedness, the antithesis to the greatest commandments of loving God and loving our neighbor. The damaging of the relationship between God and human beings, echoed by the breakdown of relationships between human beings. This picture that Paul paints, is a picture of humanity under God's wrath. And in its description, David Turner suggests that 6 interconnected themes emerge, and we're going to go through those very, very quickly tonight. First, we have the suppression of truth. An honest evaluation of the world in which we live reveals that with all our sophistication in science and technology and civilization, what we consider civilization, human beings so often settle for ignorance when it comes to spiritual realities. And Paul says here that this is an unacceptable excuse. He argues that everyone knows that God exists. Actually, if you read this closely, he would make the argument that there is no such thing as an atheist. An atheist would be a complete idiot. He says everyone knows that God exists. Everyone has an innate knowledge of God placed within by God himself, an inward conviction and a conscience. But then Paul adds to that creation itself confirms and declares this same message. Therefore, men are without excuse. So humanity's problem is not a lack of spiritual awareness, but it is an ungodly response to the truth that it has been given. Verse 25 says, "They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator." Second thing that happens, and this is kind of a pattern, this is kind of a progression, this is, I'm going to say later, a downward spiral. Second, we have the corruption of religion. Where truth is suppressed, religion is corrupted and idolatry reigns. Verse 21, they did not glorify God or give him thanks. Verse 23, they exchanged the glory of God for images of created things. Now, idolatry could be described as any activity or attitude where God is not honored or not thanked the way that he should be. Every person, Paul argues once again, knows that God exists, knows something of what God is like, knows that there exists the realities of right and wrong, knows from conscience and creation that God deserves the glory. And verse 32, Paul even hints that every single person even has some sense of the judgment to come. Third, futility of thinking. When people reject God, suppressing the truth, not only is religion corrupted, but thinking as well. Verse 21 says, thinking became futile, and foolish hearts were darkened. In other words, to be out of alignment with God is to suffer intellectual damage. Sin doesn't just wreck a person spiritually and morally, it wrecks a person intellectually as well. When God is excluded from our thinking, when God is excluded from our worldview and our life view, thinking itself becomes futile. Outrageously, despite all this, in verse 22, the fools claim to be wise. And take note of verse 28. Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. It's a downward spiral being revealed here, and it only gets worse. We're only halfway through. Fourth, impurity of desire. All sin begins in the mind. And God's wrath, as I mentioned before, is understood here in giving people what they want, giving them over to, verse 24, the lust of their hearts, verse 26, dishonorable passions. Sinful desires, we know, manifest themselves in our personal behavior. But you know what? It doesn't stop there. Self-destructive behavior quickly becomes behavior that is destructive of others as well. So fifth, we have the perversion of relationships. And I want you to notice how Paul covers the entire landscape here with regard to sexuality. He even-handedly refers to both males and females. He refers to both actions and passions, and he situates his argument in the same way that he does the other issues. I don't know if you noticed this, but in verse 23 it says, they exchange God's glory for images. In verse 25 it says, they exchange the truth for a lie. And now in verse 26, they exchange natural relations for unnatural relations. So I think it's a mistake to believe that Paul highlights homosexuality because he regarded it as somehow more sinful than other forms of sexual immorality. On the contrary, he seems to highlight homosexuality simply because for Paul it is this undisputable characteristic of an idolatrous society. This is where things are going to go when God is removed from the public square, when God is removed from the people's consciences. And because homosexuality demonstrates this clear reversal of God's created order, he holds it up and uses it as an example. Which, by the way, is at the heart of Paul's entire argument here. Because all of the exchanges that Paul mentions are destructive for the very reason that they go against God's created order. They are all pursuits of things not the way that God intended them to be. Where there is confusion about God, there will inevitably be confusion about sexuality. And the result, like all sin, having played itself out, the result is sexual chaos. The relational perversion that comes when people ignore God and refuse to honor his ways. And so finally, sixth, the disintegration of society. When we started somewhere that was a little bit manageable. Now we're at the disintegration of society. This is serious stuff. Paul in these verses is not isolating individual sins for specific treatment. And the list we find at the close of chapter 1 is not meant to be an exhaustive list. Just to remind you of what this list is. This is a description of a world left to its own devices. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. The point is that you cannot reject God from your personal life, your social life, or your societal life without profoundly affecting all of them. When we are out of alignment with God, we find ourselves out of alignment with each other, out of alignment with ourselves, because we are going against what we were created to be. And when we go against what God created us to be, chaos is the result. And verse 32 circles us right back to where we started. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Brothers and sisters, the wrath of God is being revealed. Judgment has already begun. God is already giving people up to the choices they have made and the consequences of those choices. The good news is that this is just one of two principles that are at work in the world today. This is just one of two. This is the wrath of God revealed against godlessness and wickedness. I want to remind you of the other one which we looked at last week. The second is the principle of God's righteousness that Paul pointed to in verses 16 and 17, where he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. It's not over until it's over. Even when God lets us go our own way, He calls for us to return. He makes a way for us to return through His Son, Jesus Christ, and He waits for us like the prodigals we so often are. He provides for us a righteousness that is perfect, a righteousness that is not our own, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. That is the gospel. And to use Paul's words, we are not ashamed. Amen.